Hello and welcome to another tip video here from Zenatta Consulting. My name is Tyler Colts, and this video is actually an excerpt from our full product tutorial on Zoho CRM from February of 2023. In this specific video, we'll be covering some of the automation options within CRM, including layout rules, blueprints, as well as workflow rules. Before we jump in, I do want to ask, if you find this video useful, please be sure to like and subscribe down below. And if you have any feedback or questions, please leave those in the comments section as we try to read and respond to each and every one of those on our weekly podcast, the CRM Zen Show. Thanks and enjoy. So yeah, we're going to jump right on in here to a quick walkthrough, like Brett mentioned, of workflows and blueprints. I'll kind of cover the differences between them as we go along with a couple examples here. So I have a few that we're going to run through just to get an idea of kind of how these things work in practice. So we'll first set up a workflow that's based on an update to a record that will set up a follow-up task and an email reminder. We'll also then set up like a date-based workflow. So rather than being an immediate action on a trigger, we'll set one up that'll happen on a future specified date. And then lastly, we'll kind of run through a quick blueprint example so that we can take a look at that. So if we go ahead and open up one of our deals, I'm going to use printing dimensions here. We'll see that they are currently in this identify decision makers stage. Like Brett mentioned, these can all be customized via your pipeline. But in this case, a common thing that we're asked is when we're moving over to essentially our proposal stage, we need some internal reminders to make sure we get that out the door. And then we also need some external reminders to make sure that our client is seeing the proposal. So to solve for that, we can essentially use a workflow rule inside of CRM. So here I open up a new tab just so we can flip back and forth. And I'm in the settings section. I'll go to workflow rules. And I'll go ahead and create a workflow rule. So you can think about workflows essentially as a structured if-then statement. So if a certain thing happens, I want a different thing to happen automatically. So here we're going to choose our module, which will be deals. Give it a name. So I'll just call this proposal follow-up process. And now here we're kind of in the page where we can actually go ahead and configure this workflow. So there are three different types. We can trigger a workflow on a record action, which is essentially an update to a field, the creation of a record, the delete of a record. We can do them based on a date time field, or we can do them based on a change to score. In this webinar, we're going to do an example of a record action as well as a date time. Score is going to work essentially the same as a record action, so we don't need to do one of those. So in this case, we want a workflow that's going to trigger when we move into the proposal and price quote stage. So I'm going to do this on a record action. We're going to do this as either a create or edit or delete. This basically defines what the trigger will be that will cause this to happen. In this case, I'm going to actually do on create or edit, right? Because while the normal flow might move through all of these steps, it's totally possible that you might have, let's say, a request a quote form on the website rather than a contact us. And maybe a submission like that should skip all these steps, right? Maybe it should just create a deal in this stage and just kick off the process. So I'm going to do this as a create or edit. You could also do it as an edit, right? And say when a specific field like stage gets modified, then we're going to run this. But again, just because there is in my head this path that a deal might take that skips some steps, we're going to do it as a create or edit workflow. And now here, we're going to define, this is kind of our criteria, right? So if a deal is created or edited to match this criteria, then we're going to have it do the things, right? So here we'll say if we edit it such that stage is proposal price quote, then we want to do some things, right? So essentially up here is our if, and down here with our actions is our then. So we're going to do a couple different actions with this workflow. So right out of the gate, the first thing that we're going to do is create a task. If we look at all the options we can do, right, we can update fields, we can change the owner, we can assign or remove tags, We can set up email notifications, which I'll show. We can do tasks like an internal notification. We can create entire records. We can trigger webhooks, which will send data outside of Zoho. And then we can run custom functions, which could be their whole own webinar. So we're going to stay away from those just for now. So let's say that we want to create a task immediately to send proposal to customer. Here we can define what the due date should be, right? So in this case, let's say that once we've had a proposal request, we give ourselves 2 days to get that out the door, right? So this is going to be due 2 days after it's created. We can set a default status. Pretty much should always be not started. We can define a priority. In this case, I would say sending a proposal is pretty high, so we'll leave that there. And then we can assign it to a user or to the owner of that record. In our demo account, we just have one user, so it's going to just assign to Zenatta demo. But by default, it's essentially going to look at whoever this deal owner, contact owner, account owner is, and assign them the record, or assign them the task. We can also set this up to email that user, so they could actually receive an email notification that they've been assigned a task. That might be helpful. I like to have those off because I get too many emails as is, and I kind of work through my task list when I'm in CRM. We can also have it set up a little pop-up reminder, either via email or via a pop-up inside the CRM, which is pretty nice. And so let's go ahead and save and associate that. So now essentially on day 0 or on minute 0, right, we're going to create this task. But let's say that we're going to assume that because this task has 2 days to get done, maybe we want to queue up a automatic reminder after 5 days to check in on the proposal, right? So this reminder would either go out, anywhere from 2 to 4 days after we've sent this proposal. So I can have a delay, and I can go ahead and set up an email notification. Here I'm going to create a new one. Call it proposal follow-up. Now here we can define who we want this to go to, right? So it can go to either the, a email address that's directly on the deal, or it can go to the email of the related contact, right? So even though Donette's email is not actually on this record, right? Nowhere on this record does it actually have this email stored. We can still send the email to this person. So it's no big deal. We can go ahead and send that out. Next, we'll need to choose an email template. I'll go ahead and create one just really quick so I can show you a couple things. So here within our email templates, there are 2 ways you can structure it, either through like an HTML table that's going to apply some formatting. One thing to know with these is they kind of come out centered, right? Kind of like a marketing email. A lot of the times we recommend that we use these HTML or plain text templates because they look like hand-typed email. So I'm working up here in the top left, and we'll give this email template a name. And this is just internal. And then we'll give it an external name, which will be our subject line. And here, I'll show you I can actually type pound and merge in data from the deal, the related account, the contact, right? So maybe I want to see Zenatta / client name and then proposal check-in, right? Just something like that. Now that same pound symbol is going to work inside the email content. So I can hit pound here. Rather than choosing from deals or accounts, I can go down to contacts and choose that first name. Lastly, I can actually also merge in, not from any of these records, but my own email signature if I have that stored inside the CRM. So now I have this easy template. It's right here. Obviously, it's not very well written, but it does merge in their company name, the person's name, and my signature. So I will go ahead and save that now. Oops, I need to do a folder. And the cool thing when you're doing these workflows is that you can just come right back to that workflow without having to change anything, and your template will show up. So if you don't have all of your email templates created before you start making the workflow, you're not doomed. You don't have to put in dummy templates. You can just kind of write them as you go. Lastly, we can define who this email should come from. So it can come from me, the user who's working in the record owner, or kind of this other user lookup that we have. Now I'm going to use the record owner because generally speaking, if, let's say I'm the one who they've been talking to, receiving this follow-up from me probably makes the most sense. So I'll go ahead and save that. And now here we could add a whole bunch of these follow-on actions, right? So I could have day 5, day 10. We're going to keep it with just the one. But one thing I do like to highlight is that these scheduled actions are not set in stone, meaning if this stage changes on, let's say, day 3, this email will not go out, right? So as long as we're keeping the CRM up to date, we don't need to worry about these automations misfiring at the wrong time. So now I'm going to go ahead and save this workflow. It's going to turn it on here for our deal. Now I'm going to jump back over to printing dimensions, and I'm going to move that stage to proposal price quote. And so now here we'll see that the screen kind of refreshed. It did a sneaky refresh. I don't know if you caught it. If you're watching the video, you can go back a little and see it does a little tiny refresh. And now we see that this new task is created to send the proposal to the customer, and its due date is on the 23rd because today is the 21st, and we gave ourselves 2 days to do this. Now, one little bonus tip here about workflows is that within our timeline, we can see every time that a workflow triggers. So you can kind of know, like, was this task created by Tyler or by Zoho automations, right? And it will also show any future scheduled actions. So it's essentially showing us here on February 26th, we are scheduled to send this next email, right? And that's going to happen if our stage still is proposal price quote on that particular date. If I were to move it out, let's say they got back to us, right, on the proposal, then now that action is no longer upcoming, right, because it doesn't satisfy our criteria. So I think that should essentially cover it for workflow number 1. For workflow number 2, we're going to do one that, save this part of the video. We set this up for many, many, many clients all the time. It's a pretty useful one. So this is going to be a combo of a workflow and what's called a layout rule inside of CRM. A layout rule is essentially a way that we can conditionally make a field appear or even be required on the page. So this workflow is going to be essentially to set up a follow-up date and a reminder to follow up on that date, right? So here I have our stage requested follow-up, and down below I have my follow-up date. But, maybe you have a big sales team, you need some process management. What happens if I put this in requested follow-up, but I don't set the date that I'm going to follow up? I'm probably not going to follow up on that deal. And now we've lost potential revenue. So within here, I'll go into our settings again, and the cog in the top right. I'll go under modules and fields. I will jump into deals and into layout rules. I'm going to create a new one. I'll call it follow-up date requirement. We're going to choose our primary field. So this is the field that will control the layout rule. It's not the field that we're going to require in the layout rule. It's the field that's going to trigger the layout rule to happen. So essentially we're going to say here, if the stage goes to requested follow-up, we want some things to happen, right? And so here, maybe I want to show this field, so it's actually going to be hidden unless we're in this stage. And then I could also go ahead and trigger a requirement of that field here under set mandatory fields. Set our follow-up date is mandatory. Again, we're saying in this case, our potential client asked us to follow up, right? They didn't say no. They just said, my budget refreshes in 3 months. Check in with me then, right? So I'm going to go ahead and give this one refresh before we trigger it so you can kind of see the whole flow. And so now we'll see there is no follow-up date field showing because of our new layout rule. But if I move this to requested follow-up, it's now popped up that I have to fill in this field, right? I have to say when I'm going to follow up. Otherwise, I shouldn't be moving it into this stage at all because I don't actually have any next steps. So now I'm going to go ahead and save that. And now right away, we'll see that that field now pops in. We can see it, and it's filled in that date. And so the last thing that we might be thinking is, okay, but March 3rd is, 3 weeks out, 4 weeks out. I don't have the best memory. So what's going to happen on that date? So if we want something to happen, we'll go back to our workflow rules. We'll create a new one. because this is a new if-then statement, it's going to be a new workflow. It's one terminology thing with Zoho that's important. A lot of us think about a workflow as like the 30 steps that get us where we need to go. The way they use it is kind of like each step might be its own workflow, or maybe one or two of them get put together. Here, we'll say our follow-up reminder. Let's get on a date. It's going to ask us what date, right? What's the relevant date for this? Now, you can actually make these relative. You could say 1 day before, 1 day after, 2 days after, right? I'm just going to say on for now. We'll set a time of day, and you can actually set a recurrence. So you could say every month, every year, follow up and do this same task. I'm not going to do that for now. We're just going to keep it nice and simple. Now, we are going to add a criteria for stage is requested follow-up. And now you might be thinking, why would we do that? Well, the reason is I set this reminder for March 3rd. What if on March 1st, they actually get in touch with me and they're like, hey, I'm ahead of schedule. Let's get the ball rolling, right? I no longer need that reminder. So I would move it out of requested follow-up into a new stage. And that would, again, kind of turn off this automation from running. So now here, last but not least, I'll go ahead and just add a quick task just so we can close the loop on this. Follow up on deal. We'll say we have 2 days for it. Now we have a workflow that on that date will actually remind us automatically to follow up on this proposal. So essentially just sets us up to win this deal, right? Because otherwise this thing goes into the void and we forget about it and we do not follow up with as much consistency on that date. So last little section here is going to be on blueprints. So there was a question in the chat. I think it was from Mark. So Mark had asked, what's the deal, right? You've got workflows, you've got blueprints, like when do I use one? When do I use the other? So the way that you can think about it is workflows happen in the background, right? A workflow is just based on what the user is doing. There's a whole sequence of if-then statements that automate next steps and automate future actions and calculations and assignments. The difference with a blueprint is that it really takes control of the system and it moderates and manages how the user interacts with a record. So a really common blueprint that we'll set up is around deal stages, right? Essentially saying that certain steps in our pipeline require certain things. And so in this case, let's say moving from qualification to needs analysis, maybe we want was to have to fill in this needs analysis section that we've just so conveniently added to this demo account. And so to do that, you could do that with a workflow or a layout rule, right? The same way that I said when requested follow-up is hit, require our follow-up date field. But if you wanted to build 5 or 6 steps that all have those requirements, you'll start to want to consider using a blueprint. And so here, I'll show you a quick example. We're just going to blueprint out one stage. Obviously, these take a good amount of forethought to really make these work. So I'm going to create a new blueprint, call it primary pipeline, mark it under the deals module. We're going to choose a stage. So this is going to be our main stage here, our main field that's going to manage this. Now, what's important to know is that once you have chosen a stage and used it, or a field and used it in a blueprint, you can only update that field via the blueprint. So it becomes a very sticky system. You have to use it a certain way. And so here, we're going to go into our blueprint builder, and this will probably feel pretty familiar. It's kind of like a drag and drop interface. So we're going to start at qualification, which makes sense, right? We're going from qualification and needs analysis. I'm going to drag in stage 2. I'm going to say that there should be a path from here to here, right? And now in this transition, the transitions is where all the work happens. I'm going to give this transition a name. Now we could do a whole webinar on blueprints. This is going to be high level, right? We're going to cover a couple of the things you can do, but this is a very, very deep system. So essentially, blueprint transitions are what do a lot of the work, and they break down into 3 primary sections. So things that happen before the blueprint, which essentially just determines if the criteria should even show up or if the transition should show up and who should be able to press it. The during, which is a big workhorse part we're going to circle right back to, which includes things like requiring a note, requiring an attachment, requiring fields. And then lastly, things that should happen after Should it send an auto email? Should it set up a task? Should it run a function, right? Once we have actually moved into that new stage. So for this one, I'm going to primarily use these during actions because most of what you can do with after could just be done with a workflow, right? So kind of the astute viewers might be seeing, well, if I'm just going to move from qualification to needs analysis, didn't you just show us that we could just send an email with a workflow? Yes, but it's kind of nice to bake it into this process if you are going to implement a blueprint, just so that you have everything in one place. But really, the meat and potatoes here of blueprints are the during, right? And so what I want to do is essentially set up that in order to move out of qualification, we need to have completed these fields. And so what I'm going to do on the blueprint side is say that project type is going to become mandatory. IAM budget is going to become mandatory. And required completion date is going to become mandatory. Let's say that's kind of our base qualification info. So then last thing here, I'll kind of show you a couple quick little things within blueprints, and then we'll jump back to the record. You can create really, really big flows in here that capture all different types of processes and steps. You can also create things that'll show here as essentially what are called common transitions. So, essentially stage to stage to stage, things could go multiple ways, right? So maybe sometimes from needs analysis, you go to negotiation. Sometimes you go to, a different type of environment. But the big one here, let's say you have something like closed won. Actually, I'll show you we'll do closed won. UI's being a little upset with me here. Within a transition like closed won, we might want to say that we could actually get to closed won from a lot of different places, right? And so to do that, we can actually set up this transition as what's called common, where now multiple different states that we're in are going to have this as an available transition, right? So we might not know that we're going to win it until a certain point, but if we need to have that ability to kind of skip the line, we can set up those as kind of predefined paths here within our system. Now I'm going to clean up my mess just a little because I just want this to be super simple for our demo. We're just going to do a one-step blueprint here. And there's actually nothing wrong with doing a one-step blueprint. If the rest of the process needs to be more flexible, it's totally okay, right, to say that we're just going to blueprint this part and then the rest of it, we're going to manage separately. So now here, back to our CRM in the deals. Might have to create a new one here so that it will go through a new flow. Let's create an example deal. Pick it up to any of these. And so now here, this is a deal that's in a blueprint. So this top section looks different, right? You don't have the access to all those different stages because now the process is being managed a lot more finely. And when I go ahead and try to move it to needs analysis, I'm going to get a prompt where I must fill in these things to proceed, right? And once I fill them in, now I can save it, right? And in this case, we don't have the rest of this blueprinted, so the world kind of opened back up to me and I can move on from there. And of course, all of those fields are going to be stored here just directly connected to that record where we collected the info. So I think with that should cover essentially the high-level overview here of workflows and blueprints, with a field-based trigger, a date-based trigger, and then lastly, kind of a quick little blueprint to manage the collection of some data.